been reading the news about corporations over the last few months? Wells Fargo. Heard about Wells Fargo over the last, actually few years. Wells Fargo is known these days for employees setting up millions of fake accounts without their clients' knowledge. And the news media says the reason for that is it was a culture of unrealistic sales goals that overcame any ethics that they had. How about United Airlines? Heard about them in the last year? An attendant at United Airlines drug a passenger off the plane. The passenger happened to be from Louisville, Kentucky, as you may recall. Got a lot of attention about a year ago, or maybe a little longer than that. And the news media said that that incident was due to a culture where people's actions were scripted and they had very little leeway to use their better judgment. How about Nike? You probably heard about them in the last 2 weeks because Nike has been in the news for their women who led a revolt because of discrimination and sexual harassment. Their CEO got the whole organization together to talk about the culture and to talk about what he referred to as the old boy culture and the problems that he apologized for in that culture. And finally, last but not least, Volkswagen. And they've been back in the news too in the last few. They've been in the news now for what, 2 or 3 years? And again, last week, 2 weeks ago, they were back in the news because their former CEO, Winterkorn, was indicted for fraud for the emissions scandal. So I'll have to say that the cultures of corporations haven't really gotten very good press lately. And I ask myself as I look at those headlines, what do they all have in common? And I found a couple things that they have in common. One is they have leaders that supported a culture that allowed for malfeasance. They all have that in common. And I know that many of us think that culture is one of those squishy concepts that you can't really tie down. It's very concrete. Culture is about what leaders do. It's about what leaders condone. It's about what leaders encourage, what leaders reward. So it really is all about leadership and what the leaders do with the culture. Now, having gone through all the bad news, it's not all bad news. There have been some good news stories about corporations in the last few months, and I wanted to show you Danone. I don't know, I'm sure you're familiar with their products. You may not be familiar with the company. Danone is the company that makes Dannon yogurt, Evian water, Silk. I think Silk's a type of milk, a non-dairy milk. It's a big company, and they became, in the last month, they became the biggest global corporation to become a B corporation, a benefits corporation. Do you all know what that is? Do any of you know what that is? A B corporation is a company that makes a lot of money still, and trust me, Danone makes a lot of money, but they have a dual mission, and they put that mission, they make that mission part of their legal entity. And that mission is that, yes, they want to make a profit, that's part of their mission, but the other part of their mission is to be a force for good in the world. And for Danone, it has to do with food. And they've got very specific things that they say about using food as a way to be a force for good. And that's a good news story for Danone, because that is quite an honor for a huge company like Danone. It all goes back to leadership again. Their founder founded the company based on the idea that businesses could be successful financially and could also be a force for good. And you can see back in 1972, he said that when people enter that factory door, we affect their lives. Those of us who own these businesses, those of us who lead these businesses, we affect their lives. And the least we can do is make those lives better. So the company was founded based on this idea that they could do good and make money, and they've proven that they can do that. So what I want to talk to you today about, first of all, I want to challenge you to think about this. I think you've probably been thinking about it all day from what I gather and looking at the things that the other speakers have talked about. How can you be a leader with purpose and passion in state government? And I want to say, as I think about state government, I've always worked in the private sector, well, most of the time. And yet, when I think about state government, you probably have a better opportunity than anybody in the private sector to do good, because that's what you're all about. You're all about providing a service, and you have the opportunity to affect every citizen in the state. You build the roads, you take care of the schools, you're in charge of justice, and on and on and on. So if anybody has the opportunity to work with purpose and meaning, it would be those of you sitting in this audience, I believe. I'd like to talk about 3 steps that I believe are very important in becoming even more purposeful and more passionate about our leadership. And the first is engaging with purpose. And what I mean by that is knowing what your life purpose is. Why are you here? What are you uniquely positioned to be and do in life? And then looking at how your work fits with that life purpose and engaging all of yourself into that purpose, both life and then with your work. And then secondly, discovering passion. And I'm talking about your own passion. Chances are, though, is if you know what your purpose is, you're going to have passion about it, because passion follows purpose. So then the second part of that is to understand the purpose of the people who work for you, know how to inspire them, know how to tap their passion. And then the third piece is to value differences. Let's start. Step 1, engage with purpose. I want you to do something for me. If you've got a pencil and a paper, and I think most of you do, I see you out there with your pencils and papers. If you don't, get them out, because I've got several things I want you to do over the next few minutes. What I'd like for you to do is think about your work. And what I'd like for you to do is, on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 meaning you hate your work, and 5 meaning you love your work, write down a number. How do you feel about your work on a scale from 1 to 5? You got it? Everybody got it? I hope there's nobody in the audience who can identify with Drew Carey in this slide. However, if you do identify with this slide, I highly encourage you to rethink what you're doing, because it's not true that all people hate their work. It's just not true. There are those of us who really love our work. And so if you do hate your work, if you chose a 1, think about it. Maybe you're in the wrong place. Maybe you're not thinking about the purpose of your work right. But I don't think there's probably anybody in the room who really can identify with this slide. All right, now, maybe, I see a few people, talk to me afterwards. Now I've got something else I want you to do. I want you to ask yourself, what is the purpose of your work? And I've got some alternatives here, and what I'd like for you to do is choose the alternative that comes the closest to how you would describe the purpose of your work and write it down. Just the letter. You don't have to write the whole sentence down, just the letter. Of course, all of us work for pay. I'm included. That's a given. But what else? What is the purpose of your work from your point of view? And I want you to turn to your neighbor, somebody sitting beside you or sitting behind you, and I want you to tell them what your purpose is and ask them to tell you what their purpose is. Let's take just a minute or two to do that. All right. Was everybody able to do that? I heard some folks up here in the front say every single one of those is valid, and I think you're absolutely right. I do. I think you're right. I would argue, however, and actually this is a question for you because you wrote down a number for how you felt about your work. And I want you to look at that number or think about that number again and then think about what you chose up there in terms of purpose. And my guess is that those of you who chose C or D as your primary purpose, not that they're not all valid, they are, but those of you who chose C or D probably had 4s or 5s on your scales for how much you liked your work. Yeah, I see some heads nodding. That's not always the case, but that's often the case because passion follows purpose. Once you know why you're doing what you're doing, it's a whole lot easier to get excited about it. Let me tell you my story. Everybody has a story, and I've got one. I want to tell you that I started my business when I was 30 years old. I've been in business a long time. I like to tell people I started when I was 2, but that's not really the case. I started when I was 30 years old. I'd been teaching at Transylvania University previously. Some of you probably have heard of Transylvania. Anybody go to Transy? Anybody? No? Okay. Well, anyway, I taught at Transylvania for a few years, and while I was teaching at Transylvania, I started doing employee development work at IBM, the IBM facility in Lexington. And at the time, IBM was going through a huge change. And what they were doing is they were changing from making one product to another product. And I just have to be honest with you, they were going from making Selectric typewriters to personal computers. That's been a long time ago. And because I was out there, and I'm a psychologist, they asked me, they didn't want to lay anybody off during this transition, but people were going to lose their jobs because they didn't have the right skills anymore. Building Selectric typewriters is not the same as building computers. And so because they didn't want to lay people off, they asked me to help them set up a process for transitioning people to new careers. And I loved that. I helped them set up a retraining program. I helped them think about what this would mean to the people and their families. I ended up being in every IBM facility in the country during those times. And that's how I started my business. It was by accident, folks. It truly was by accident. But here's what happened. I loved it so much because it was connected to what my life purpose is. And I came to understand my life purpose during those days. The way I articulate my life purpose is this. I want to touch everybody I run into with respect and support so that they can recognize their own strengths and thrive. That's how I see my life purpose. And I was able to do that through the IBM work. So here I am. I've been in all these facilities. I had to hire people to help. I didn't know anything about running a business, but I started a business. And what I did at the time is I hired mostly women who had young families, young children. I was able to give them flexible schedules, and we worked like a family ourselves, and it was really wonderful. We were all very engaged in what we did. But over time, I got this big idea that I wanted to grow as a business, and I lost track of my purpose. What happened was I didn't know anything about running a business, so I looked at the big consulting firms and the big law firms and all the professional services firms, and I started mimicking what they did. And I started setting quotas for people. They had to go out and do work. They worked day and night. They worked weekends. If they didn't meet their quota, they didn't get their bonus. Everybody became really unhappy, as you can imagine. We were making lots of money. We were doing a lot of training, a lot of various kinds of work, mostly training, and we were selling our services to the highest bidder. So sometimes what we were doing is we were providing training that really was more like entertainment. It really wasn't helping anybody. It was entertaining people. But, you know, where's the purpose in that? I wasn't prepared to be an entertainer, and so I'm driving people like crazy. I'm unhappy myself. We're doing work for companies that we may not even respect. And then something really important happened. There was a big embezzlement in my company. For me, it was a huge embezzlement. And we almost went bankrupt. And that to me was a real turning point because I thought, I just can't do this anymore. I don't like this work. I'm not happy. Nobody likes me anymore. My employees really pretty much hate me at this point. I'm going to find something else to do. And then something miraculous happened. I got a client. It was BC Hydro in Vancouver, Canada, a wonderful company, and they talked about something I'd never heard of before. They talked about the triple bottom line. Have any of you heard of that? I had never heard that phrase used before. And what they were talking about is their commitment to people, planet, and profits, all three, and balancing those three. And I went, wow, you can do that and stay in business? And all of a sudden, with that, what I'll now call an epiphany, I went back to my team and said, let's change. Let's do this differently. I need to be back in touch with my purpose, and you need to be in touch with yours. Let's come up with something better. And that's when our culture of collaboration and contribution was born. Now, of course, anytime you make those sorts of changes, there are consequences. I had to do things differently. I enabled people to live wherever they wanted to in the country. They no longer had to come to a building. We chose our clients carefully. We only worked with companies where we thought we could really make a contribution. So that meant we turned down work. So for a while, that was really scary. But I'll have to say it was definitely worth it. And again, I think for me, it brought me back to my original purpose. And that's what I challenge each of you to continue to ask yourself. Bring yourselves back to what is your purpose in life and where does work fit in? All right, second. The second step is to discover the passions of your employees. Now, of course, first you have to know what your own passions are, because you can't inspire anybody else if you're not inspired. I found that out the hard way. And, of course, we don't really want to misinterpret what we're talking about with passion. I think some of the Nike executives got a little carried away and talked about work passion in a different way than I'm talking about it today. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about that inspiration that you find with work, that engagement that you find. And I don't want you to think that you know what engages your employees, because people make a lot of assumptions, a lot of which are not true. Now I'm going to give you another task here briefly. I want you to write it down so you can be honest. When you hear the phrase most of the time, what percentage do you think that refers to? What percentage of the time is most of the time? Write it down, please. Some of you aren't writing. Got it? All right, I want to see a show of hands. How many said 90% or above? Okay. How many said 80% up through 90%? A few. Okay. 75%? Okay. 60% up to 75? All right. 50% up to 60. Anybody below 50? All right. There's always someone below 50. In every group, there's someone below 50. I love that little experiment. It always works. Always. I've never been with a group when that didn't work. And it's such an easy way to see what happens when we make assumptions. We all use that phrase most of the time. All of us use that phrase. And yet, if we're assuming that what we mean by most of the time is what everybody else means by most of the time, we'd be dead wrong. Did you see the way the hands came up in the room? There was a huge variation in what people think. And that will be true about your employees as well. So my advice to you is to listen, ask and listen. And each employee is likely to define meaningful work differently because each of us is unique. So you have to work at finding out what engages your employees. Third step, value differences. And by this, yes, I'm talking about diversity, folks, but I'm not just talking about the kind of diversity you can see. What I'm talking about is diversity in the way you think or in the way people think. Recognize this guy? You've probably seen him as a TV star. He's been in Dancing with the Stars. He's been in The Big Bang Theory. And so many of you may not know that he had a different career before he was a TV star. He invented the personal computer. And yes, of course, this is Steve Wozniak. Steve Wozniak has a very interesting story in that when he invented the personal computer, he was working for Hewlett-Packard, and he went to Hewlett-Packard 5 times to try to sell that idea to them. 5 times. And he says he begged them to take it seriously, and they did not. And their thinking was, and the feedback he got was, why would anybody want a personal computer? Who would need a personal computer? Well, the rest is history, and legend has it that Mr. Hewlett at some point said, well, you win some, you lose some. Yeah, understatement, I'd say. So, moral of the story here is don't diss the disruptors, because they're the ones who change the world. And have the courage to be a disruptor if you have a crazy idea, a new idea, because then you'll be the one to change the world. All right, let's just review. We're almost out of time. We're talking about 3 things. We're talking about engaging with purpose, discovering passion, and valuing differences. And look, I know that we all find passion in a number of different ways, and we should. We get purpose through our families. We get purpose through our church, through our hobbies. That's true of all of us. But think about this. We spend over 1/3 of our life at work. 1/3 of our life or more. So if we're not finding meaning in our work, if we're not finding purpose in our work, we're wasting 1/3 of our life. Who wants to be in that position? And I want to ask you to think about something. You don't have to answer this. I'm not going to ask you to write it down, but I want you to think about it. How often do you bring your whole self to work? 100% of the time? 80%? 70%? Again, I'm not going to ask for hands. How? What? Most of the time. I deserve that. I truly do. I deserve that most of the time. So now we've got a range from below 50% to 90%. I have used this with groups when it was a little more intimate and I knew the people. And I usually, when I have used it with groups, what I hear is there are some people who never bring their whole selves to work. And that's a sad state of affairs. So what I'd like to say is, as a leader who wants to lead with purpose and passion, create a culture where you can bring your whole self to work and where everybody can bring their whole selves to work most of the time, I'll say, if not all of the time. I want to tell you that in preparing this presentation today, it made me very reflective of my own life. And I remember being a little girl in a very small town in Indiana, a town of 1,000 people. We had one flashing light in town, no grocery store, little tiny town. But it was wonderful because I lived next door to my grandmother. And we had this big lot between our 2 houses, and in that lot was a garden. And it had all kinds of fruit and vegetables and flowers. And as I was thinking about my childhood, I was thinking about those plants. And those plants, each category of plants served a different purpose. There were some that just smelled good. There were others that had a medicinal purpose. And then there were those that were just beautiful. And there were those that nourished us, ones that we could eat. And what I realize when I'm thinking about those plants is that each plant with its purpose contributed to this magnificent garden. And I want to leave you, if I can find it, with a couple of quotes. I can remember it. I won't quote him exactly. I can remember it. David Attenborough is a journalist from Great Britain who said, there are approximately 4 million different types of plants and animals in the world. He said that's 4 million plants and animals that can provide solutions to what it means to stay alive. Think about that. And the other thing I want you to think about is cultivate the garden that you want to grow. So what I would like to leave you with is this. Find your meaning. Find your meaning in life. Be able to articulate what's meaningful to you in life. And connect your work with what's meaningful to you in life, because meaningful work and meaningful lives go together. And go out and lead your people with that passion and purpose that you feel when you discover what it means to have meaningful work. And help your people find their passion and purpose so that they too can contribute to that beautiful garden that creates magic. Thank you.